David Mansfield is my guest, and David is an old friend, and it's very good to have you here, mate.
It's great to be here, Dominic. Thank you very much for the invitation. Please don't use the word old with that sort of emphasis.
David and I worked together with John Chapman for 4 years in 1998, 99, 2000, 2001. I think it might have even been into 2002 as well. But we were part of the Anglican Church's Department of Evangelism staff team, and you were the director, and Chapo was kind of the evangelist emeritus or something.
Chapo had been the director for something like 25 years,
yes.
And he retired. Well, he moved to a new phase of ministry where the demands of teaching at both Moore College and SMBC were great. And so he wanted someone else to take over running the department, and he could step aside and focus on Bible teaching and, of course, itinerant evangelism.
Let's talk about our first memories of him. You go first.
I first met John in 1969. It's as clear as a bell. I was doing my higher school certificate. I was 17 years of age, and Chapo came to do a series of Bible studies each Wednesday night over 4 Wednesday nights, I think on the New Testament book 1 John, 1 John. And I was a new Christian. I'd been a Christian only a year. I didn't know who this man was. I was a part of that local church. I took some time out from the study, not sure how much study I was doing, and went along to hear these Bible talks, and I was gripped from the first meeting of John, hearing him explain the Bible, apply the Bible. Not only that, but as I asked him some questions afterwards about some of the struggles that I was having in the early stages of my Christian life, the way he answered those questions so clearly, so carefully, so directly, and yet so lovingly, really, that I was just gripped by this man's example, his ability as a Bible teacher, and his capacity to get alongside me as a young Christian man. He would have been about 40 years of age then, and he would have been 39 and I would have been 17, something like that.
So what year was that?
1969.
69. So for me, it was 86.
Yeah.
I was probably 20. It was the 26th of January 1986, so 32 years ago this weekend, and I went along to the Katoomba Christian Convention. I was a non-Christian, and I was just one of 7,000 people in the big tent that they had set up in what is now the car park area just across from the scenic railway. And John Woodhouse gave studies on Leviticus in the morning, which I have listened back to since and were brilliant. But for me as a non-Christian in 1986 went over my head.
Sure.
But in the evening, John Chapman spoke, and I trusted Christ on Australia Day 1986. It was Hebrews 12. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us and throw off everything that hinders. And it was him preaching on those that showed me Jesus. I mean, there'd been a period leading up to it. But,
sure.
I'm so thankful to God for the way he...
His ministry at Katoomba was a very, very significant ministry in tens of thousands of people's lives.
Yeah. My next interaction with him was a few years later. I was in London, and I'd met some people, and they'd confused me about theology. And it was before the internet, before you had Skype, and so I just didn't have anyone to talk to. So I rang up St Helens Bishopsgate and said, "Hi, I'm a Christian from Sydney. I'm just stuck. I just don't know what to do. Can you help me?" And they said, "We'll put you on to somebody." And they put me through it, and this voice said, "John Chapman here." And I thought, it's the man who led me to Christ.
Right.
And I asked him my question about John 14.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah.
How was he instrumental in you getting into ministry?
My next significant encounter with John, I met him on a number of occasions after 1969, and I was a student and a staff member at Hawkesbury Ag College, and we invited him out to speak at a couple of things. So we had that ongoing connection there, as well as my local church at Mowbray at Chatswood. The next significant period was when I went into Moore College and was in first year in 1975, and I became a student minister at Chappo's local church at Hurstville Grove, which was a fairly daunting experience. I'll never forget.
Did he call out during the sermons?
No, but what he would do, I'd preach. I might have preached half a dozen times a year, and he only might have been there for 2 of those 6 times because he was often preaching elsewhere.
Somewhere else, yeah.
But the times that he was there when I was there, you always had one eye on him, and he would be studiously writing notes as you were preaching. So you didn't get very much eye contact from him. He had his head down writing notes, and every now and again he would just stop, and you could tell that he looked shocked.
Yeah.
And then he would look up at you, and he would look down at his notebook as if to say, "Is that what I just heard?"
No one ever said this before.
And you also knew that he would often say things in a staged whisper, even when you were preaching, that only people within a 2-metre radius might hear.
But you might find that little section of the congregation starts laughing.
Yes. And the problem was, of course, not only for the preacher, but people outside that 2-metre radius, they want to know what he said as much as what I was saying.
Funnier than what he was saying. I remember Rico Tice telling the story of when he was working at All Souls in Langham Place, he used to be frightened of the idea of John Stott being and he used to ring up on Wednesday and says, "What's Mr. Stott's diary? Is he going to be here this week? Because I'm preaching this Sunday."
Whether I like punishment or not, I actually was disappointed when I would preach, and you'd never know whether he was going to be there or not, and he wouldn't be there.
Yeah.
I wanted him to be there.
Because of sermon feedback.
Yeah. Now, this is what happened. As soon as the service was over, and back in the days when the minister and the preacher, if they were different people, would shake hands with everybody at the door. Everybody would file past. We don't do that very often these days. I would always have, just out of the corner of my eye, I'd have a visual of Chappo and what he was doing. And he would always wait till last in the queue. He would deliberately put himself back in the queue until he was the last person to shake your hand. And he would then just spend 3-5 minutes saying a few things about the sermon. And he always said what he thought was most helpful about the sermon. And he deliberately did this later in more formal feedback sessions. It was something that he was very, very particular about. He'd always say something that was really helpful about the sermon. Then he'd always say something that could be improved about the sermon. And then he would always finish off by saying what he was challenged by. And I can still remember some of those mornings at Hurstville Grove where he did that. After college, Helen and I took our 2 small children, as they were at that stage, to Western Australia. And this only happened twice, but on 2 occasions I sent a little cassette tape of a sermon that I preached in Western Australia.
You were at Broome? Is that
I was at Karratha.
Karratha,
yeah, not that far from Broome. It's all one place up in the
Church
northwest. That's right. But I would send a cassette tape, and with my sermon on it, and then there'd be some newsy stuff that Helen and I would just talk about. And he would send the other side. He would send the same cassette tape back. And on the other side of the cassette tape, he'd have lots of newsy things that were going on in Sydney, and then he would have a formal critique of the sermon.
Wow.
Now, that probably only happened twice in 2 years, but I found those times incredibly significant, not least because of the time he took.
To invest in you.
Yeah, to do that, knowing that we were a fair way away, and there were times of loneliness, and he understood that about rural and remote ministry as well. And that gave me some understanding of the depth of this man's commitment to people as he sought to encourage them in their relationship with the Lord Jesus.
Well, that's one of the things that came out to me really clearly as I've read through this book that you've compiled, the Chappo collection. What David has done here, he's spoken to zillions of people who, in all different areas of life, have interacted with John. and some of them now quite prominent in the evangelical world, but at the times where he's talking about their contact with him were really just, I mean, the story Mike Rader tells of being kind of in Pakistan as a missionary. Hard. I mean, he knew Chapman.
He didn't have much of a history with Chapo.
No, and just like there was a political crisis, there was military unrest, the family was frightened, and John was one of the few people who rang up and said, "I'm praying for you, and what can I pray, and how are you?"
Yeah. John's commitment to prayer was exemplary.
Yeah, I've seen his prayer diary, and been amazed. Tell us about that.
Oh well, he would have pictures of families and pictures of people, and so that would be a guide to him as he would pray through that prayer diary and pray for his friends. But he would also have CMS prayer diary, other prayer diaries that he was praying for people that weren't personal friends, but people that, like the Raters, that he only knew quite only a little bit. And he was just very, very faithful in prayer. I remember him saying on one occasion, and I think this had something to do with his singleness that we might touch on. Someone asked him at a conference I was at, and I was just in the audience as well. They said, how do you do everything that you do? You just seem to be able to, do so much preaching, do so much preparation, Bible teaching ministry.
I mean, I remember at the Department of Evangelism at one point we went through how many times had we each preached in the year.
Yeah.
I think I had preached 90 times in the year, and you'd preached hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of it.
Well, you said that I got in touch with zillions of people, probably about 300 people that I contacted. Not everybody responded. Some people responded, and their stories overlapped and were very similar to other stories and so forth. But people were very, very fulsome in their encouragement of the project, the book project, and very helpful with the stories that they gave me. But the point that I was going to make in relation to his prayerfulness is when this question was asked, how do you do it all, at this conference I was at, he just said, I just roll out of bed, read my Bible, say my prayers and get on with the day. It was just so matter of fact, as if that's what we all did. Now, a part of that is singleness. There have been times in your life when you've rolled out of bed and changed a nappy.
Yeah, that's right, absolutely.
And that's true for me too.
And singleness does give you more freedom to do all sorts of things, and he exercised that freedom.
And he understood that, and he was sensitive to the fact that there were many people who didn't have that sort of freedom. And so he was never pharisaical or legalistic or overly critical of people who didn't have the work capacity and output that he had. He understood that family people had other responsibilities and other constraints. And he could somehow embrace all of that and just be very pastoral in the way that he related to people no matter what their situation in life was.
Come back to sermon critique for a minute, because I remember him ringing me up. I mean, you told a very positive story about the three helpful things, what you could do better, what was spoken to him. I remember he rang up one day and said, "Dominic, there are 7 things about this sermon." I felt like my head had been slammed against the coffee table.
That is a compliment. That is a compliment to you, Dominic, because he knew you could take it.
And then I said, "Oh, thanks very much, John. Was there anything good about it?" And he said, "Oh, it's a good talk, brother. I'm on your side. See you later."
Yeah.
He could be brusque.
Oh, he could, and it was very interesting. There was a period of time there back in the 90s and into the new century when I was in touch with him several times a week, if not daily. We lived nearby, we played tennis at least once a week together, and I was always on the lookout for how he was going and so forth, would often pick him up from the airport. So there was a period of time there when I'd be on the phone or I'd be over at his place quite a lot. And sometimes on the phone I'd ring up and he would be so brief, so abrupt, that I knew that I'd interrupted something.
Yeah.
It was probably sermon preparation. It might have been his prayers. Wouldn't say what it was, but he'd be off the phone in a flash.
Yeah.
And there were other times that I'd ring up and I'd only have a couple of minutes.
And he could talk for hours.
Well, he'd tell me the three latest jokes. He would go through some of his sermon preparation with me, and I realised that what he's doing is he's using me as a sounding board.
Yeah.
So he was taking that opportunity just to sharpen and refine some material he was working with, or even with his humour. Even though his humour comes across to us as spontaneous. And one of the things that I discovered about Chappo was there's a little bit of a contradiction in terms. Chappo says if you're not naturally funny, don't try and be funny. And he was naturally funny. And yet at the same time, he knew that good humour was something that needed to be sharpened and rehearsed. And I knew that I wasn't naturally funny, but I knew that I could retell a good joke. And so I learnt from that it was, even if you weren't naturally funny, you could still just lighten an audience up, bring an audience along with you, just by relaying a funny story, a funny anecdote. But it had to be worked at the same time. And he even worked at what was natural to him, if I can put it like that.
Now let's just go to some of those Facebook comments. We've got a comment here from Chai Chi, and they note that they first heard Chappo speak at the Mid-Coast Christian Convention in 1999 with David Cook on the topic God's Method in Our Madness. But I want to come to this one from Jess Sibrava from up in Armidale, in the Armidale Diocese, who said she loved, speaking about your book, the Chappo Collection, loved the book, just joined the Armidale Diocese, have enjoyed an opportunity to, in a small way, get to know the man behind the legend. Now, John and his story with Armidale, both as a young man, as a young minister of the gospel, and more recently through his connection with Rick and Janine Lewis, has been quite significant, the bishop up there.
John's period in Armidale was an incredibly significant period of ministry. And the other thing that I'd like to say that feeds into this is something about John's humility. Behind the confidence, you could think that John was such a confident person that he may have lacked humility. But there really was a genuine humility in this man. If he was corrected by others, he was always grateful for it. And when he went to Armidale, first as a school teacher in 1952 to teach, he actually thought that he would be a school teacher for the rest of his life. And I think he thought he would be in the Armidale region, whatever teaching region that is, for the rest of his life as well. He never imagined that different ministry opportunities would open up to him in the way that they did. And when he began to see the lack of faithful Bible teaching in churches throughout the region of the Northwest, throughout the Anglican Church of the Northwest, it became clearer and clearer to him and to Peter Chiswell, a very dear friend, and to Ray Smith, another dear friend, and there are others as well that I don't have time to mention. It became clear that what this part of the world needed was faithful Bible teachers. And that led him to Moore College, that led him back to the diocese. And he says, and I think I quote this in the book somewhere, that he thought that bringing about that kind of change throughout that country diocese would be his life's work, his life's challenge, and his life's work.
And very excitingly, I think, when you think about the Armidale Diocese, that there isn't a parish in that diocese that isn't evangelical. I mean, it's probably the most evangelical diocese in the world in the Anglican Church.
I think undoubtedly.
And if you had to say humanly who was most responsible for that, you'd probably say John Chapman.
Oh, there's no doubt that you would. Chappo would deflect that to some extent, and certainly Chappo would say God was sovereign in this matter, and there were some issues. There was the famous synod of 1965 where they couldn't get a candidate up, and they had to come back 3 months later, and he says it was an act of God's gracious sovereignty that they were able to put forward the name of Clive Curl, and he became bishop. And that was... Now, Chappo was the one who was behind all of that, although Chappo would deflect that and say, no, this was a work of God.
Now, tell me if this story is true. I've got this story in my head, but when he was a youth worker, he was working with a pastor who he didn't think was converted, and they'd be walking in the procession towards the church, and the pastor would turn to him and say, John, am I preaching this week, or are you? And he would always say, I am your grace. Is that right?
The story's not in the book. The reference is possibly to his Moree days. There is no doubt, or there is little doubt, that the rector of the parish, a very godly man with a very godly wife, who really took Chappo in as a kind of surrogate son from his Gunnedah teaching days. He was a wonderful man. This story may relate to that, although there are some question marks about whether it was then. Archdeacon Stockdale was a converted man. It was really through his efforts that the Billy Graham landline, the Billy Graham crusade of 1959, they were able to get Billy Graham broadcast, audioed, as they did with the technology of the day. They would have had this little speaker sitting on the top of the stage in the town hall or wherever the meetings were held, and it would have been crackly. It was the advanced technology of the day. Leading up to the crusade, Archdeacon Stockdale's daughter tells me, she didn't tell me, another lady told me that Sheila Stockdale, Archdeacon Stockdale's daughter, drove Chappo around town. I think Sheila was a teenager at the time, and Chappo was in his late 20s, and he had one of these loud hailers, whatever you call them, and they would just go up and down the streets of Moree, calling people to come to the town hall that night. That's right. I was told by a lady called Frances Boland, who was a missionary in Japan for many years, and Frances said Chappo at Moree at that time was just God's timing for that part of the world. And it wouldn't have happened without the goodwill, without the foresight of Archdeacon Stockdale. And on the first night, when Billy Graham called for people to come to the front and respond to the invitation to turn to Christ, the Archdeacon and his wife were first out of their seats to the front. We think as an act of renewal of a trust in Jesus that was already there.
Now, come back to Singleness, and I remember we were in the Department of Evangelism staff meeting, and a couple of the students from student ministers at that time were arguing for the singles quarters at Moore College to be renamed John Chapman House. And there was a bit of banter going on, and one of them said, "Go on, Chappo, you only got to stay single for another couple of years and you get that building named after you forever." But it did leave him lonely at points.
I don't think we appreciate just how lonely John got at times. There's a story in the book that David Seckham very kindly gave me that goes back to 1968. And so Chappo was only 38 years of age in 68. Secco was a student at Armidale University. They were at the CMS summer school, which was at Burleigh Heads on the Gold Coast. And Chappo was driving back to Armidale. Secco wanted to ride back to Coffs Harbour, and so Chappo had to make a detour and come down the highway and then over the range. And so Chappo very kindly gave Secco the ride that he wanted to Coffs. And Secco very, very boldly announced that at the age of whatever Secco was, 21 or something, that he had decided upon celibacy. This had to be the way to go, because he'd seen in John Stott and he'd seen in Chappo a model of singleness, which enabled one to be freed up for the work of the gospel. And Secco says that Chappo just exploded, and Secco says he's never seen him as animated or angry, and said, "Don't be stupid, you don't understand the loneliness." And Secco, as a 21, 22-year-old then, realised the cost for Chappo had been quite great. I think knowing Chappo as I did over the years and watching Chappo engineer his holidays to often go and be with friends overseas or friends in Australia, he made sure that he holidayed with friends. And something we often forget for single people is how difficult holidays can be, because we just assume you go on holidays, you go, you pack the wife and the kids into the car and the tent, and off you go up the coast. But it's not that simple. It's much more complicated for single people.
We've got a note here kind of endorsing really what you've said about the impact of John in the Armidale area. Tim Stevens has said, we've got so much to give thanks to God for in using Chappo in our diocese up here in Armidale. He put faithful Bible preaching on the agenda. So many people moved from death to life, not to mention the faithful gospel ministry of men like Peter Chiswell, Ray Smith, among many others. Let's go to the time of his death. And, I mean, there's obviously a story to tell, but I'm actually interested in your heart, because you were such a close friend over so many years. Tell us about those last... I mean, you tell some of the story in the book, but tell us about those last few days.
I had a South African out here doing some speaking with me by the name of Rory Stain, and we had a very, very busy week, and this was about less than a fortnight before Chappo's death, and only just prior to that, and I think this is what put Chappo in hospital for the last time, exactly a month before John's death, he went to Canberra to take his brother's funeral, his only sibling, his older brother Jim, and Chappo got himself there by plane.
He flew.
He flew. He got himself out of the airport by taxi, flew down, got picked up at the airport, and then repeated the journey home. He was far too unwell to do that. And a number of us, including someone who'd become a very, very close friend at the retirement village, Kevin Carter, were quite cranky that he hadn't asked any of us to drive him down. Now, even driving down would have been an incredibly draining experience.
But he led the service and preached, didn't he?
I got that slightly wrong in the book. He preached.
Right.
He gave one of the eulogies.
Right.
It was in a crematorium. It was run by a celebrant, whatever you call them, a funeral celebrant. There were several eulogies, and then
Jim wasn't Christian.
No, and Chappo gave the last eulogy, and I've actually, since writing the book, I've actually got a video of Chappo's contribution in that service. I wished I'd got it before the book, but one of Chappo's nephews, who I saw in Canberra recently, very kindly gave me the only copy there is. And if I do a second edition of the book, I'm going to put the whole sermon in. Anyway, that day took an enormous amount out of John, but I think John didn't want to ask any of his friends to be involved because he knew this was just a family thing, and I think he knew that it was going to be his last major family responsibility. And it wasn't long after that he was back in hospital and never came out. Anyway, Rory said, because Chappo had been to South Africa many times, and Rory's in a local Anglican church over there. Rory said, mate, can we see Chappo? And I said, yeah, we'll fit it in somehow, but he's not at all well. So on the way to an evening meeting around about 5:30 or 6 p.m. one night that week, Rory and I went to St George Hospital, and Chappo was sitting up in a chair, and he was really quite chirpy. And we had a lovely time for about 3/4 of an hour, and then we prayed, we read the Bible and prayed, and we made to leave. And Chappo said, guys, look, before you go, could you just do something for me? And he was quite embarrassed. He said, could you just take off these compression stockings that are holding in the fluid build-up in my ankle and calves? And so Rory and I said, no worries, Chappo. So we each dived for a foot, and we pulled the slippers off. That was easy. Trying to get the compression stockings off, we couldn't get our fingers between the stocking and the skin because the pressure, they were so tight. And Chappo was really embarrassed because he could see we were having difficulty. He said, "Oh, guys, I'm really sorry to ask you to do this." And Rory looked up and said, "Don't worry, Chappo. I used to do this for Mandela." And there was a thought process that went through my mind afterwards, which is in the book. But when I got outside, I said, "When did you do it for Mandela?" He said, "I can remember." He actually said, "I can remember a time in Buckingham Palace." He said late at night, Mandela came home. He'd been out to some formal evening,
presumably with the Queen.
And and Rory was in Buckingham Palace with Mandela, sleeping in the bedroom next door as his bodyguard. And Mandela said to him, "Oh, Rory, would you mind helping me get these shoes off?" Mm-hmm. Because Mandela had at the age of 80, well into his 80s, he just had a little bit of trouble getting down to take his own shoes off on that particular night. And it made me realise that, I thought, wow, what a privilege to have done that for Mandela. And I thought, oh, come on, this is a greater privilege by far,
absolutely, to
do it for Chappo. Anyway, you can read that story in the book. And then a week or so later, Kevin Carter from the retirement village where Chappo was a resident, and Kevin and Brenda had just been wonderful in Chappo's last couple of years, really, in and out of hospital, off to specialists, lots of bills to be paid. Kevin basically took over the managing of Chappo's household affairs and was a wonderful, prayerful encouragement and encourager of Chappo. And in the last 48 hours, Kevin and Brenda did the day shift and I did the night shift.
Sure.
And you can read about that in the book.
Yeah. Mate, thanks for sharing with us today on this first edition of The Pastor's Heart. Yeah. And you've got us off to a great start.
I hope that's been helpful.
It's been really encouraging. Yeah. We've been talking to David Mansfield, my old friend, and next week, 2 o'clock, we're going to be doing it here. It's The Pastor's Heart. Our guest will be Michael Callaghan, and we'll be talking about the issues of freedom of religion. He's from Freedom for Faith, and we'll be talking about the issues, this big issue relevant to all churches at the moment and all faiths in Australia at the moment, but also we'll be talking to him about his heart. Thanks very much for joining us, and see you next Tuesday at 2. We'll catch up on the podcast afterwards.